Thanks for tuning in for the next section of our study through the book of 1 Peter. Today we're going to cover a passage in chapter 2 that is one of those passages that steps on our toes really easily. It's the passage where Peter talks about our need to submit to the authorities, the governing authorities that God has placed over us. And it's something that is hard for us to hear sometimes, especially if we don't like the government that's in place over our heads at the current time. Some of us would like this kind. Some of us are on the opposite side of the spectrum, and we like that. And so if it doesn't match our philosophy, we don't like these kind of passages. And yet, Peter includes this in here as a means by which we are to live holy lives. And that is a good way, he says, of allowing what God's holiness is doing in us, what God is doing in us, allowing that to be seen by the world around us. Now teaching about the state is, there's not a lot of passages in the New Testament that really give us a lot of information about how to obey these governmental authorities. It's basically confined to a passage that you find in Mark chapter 12, where Jesus hits on it, and there's a couple of parallel passages in the other Gospels as well that hit that. Romans, obviously, is a big one. Romans chapter 13 talks about this a lot, and then Paul hits on it in his letter, 1 Timothy chapter 2, Titus chapter 3, and then you get this passage here from Peter. Let me read it to you. He says this, he says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." Now this is the first of three categories where he talks about our need for submitting to somebody or something. In this case, it's submission to the government. The next section is going to be submission to masters for slaves, and that doesn't directly correlate to our culture, but it does have underlying principles that we can learn from, and we'll cover that in another session. And then it goes to submission between husband and wife, and gives us some information on how to use our marriages in a way that displays the holiness that God is creating, that God is growing in our lives. But here in this passage, he talks first about government. We are to show ourselves as Christians as model citizens. We're not to go contrary to what our government does or what our government says, but we are to do what will commend ourselves before others in order to display the righteousness that God is creating within us. Now, that's not to say, and we'll cover this in more detail in a moment, that's not to say that there will be times when we are called to stand against what maybe our government produces because it is evil and it is not God-honoring. But I don't think those cases are as often as we seem to think they are. I think for the most part, according to Paul, according to Peter, according to Jesus himself, we are called to submit to the government that God has installed over us because God has put it there. Whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, God has instituted every governing authority. And our job is to follow that, because without government, society breaks down. We have to have laws and regulations and rules in place in order for society to work well in community. We live together. Now, in light of what just came before this, living before the world, we see the need for living under the authority of our government. Because before this, he says, you are aliens and strangers. We covered this in a previous session. And so we are to keep our behavior at such an excellent level so that those who are not Christians, they will not be able to slander us and say what we're doing is wrong, because it is so obviously what we're doing is right. That's followed up immediately by this passage that says, so submit to the government. Obey the leaders that God has put over you. We have to dismiss All of that criticism that the world might have that I am an insubordinate, or that I am rebellious, or that I am creating something that is countercultural to what our government has in place, we have to dismiss all that by our lifestyles in such a way that people can look at us and what did he say there? They may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of his visitation. That's almost identical to what Jesus said back in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, let your light shine so that others may see your good deeds and glorify God in heaven. Jesus said the same exact thing. We are to obey and submit so that others can see that we are not just submitting to the government, we are submitting to our Father in heaven. We're submitting to God. Obedience is not because of who or who may not be in our governmental structure above us. Our obedience is directly to God, who has appointed those authorities to carry out his will. Now, the crucial term which occurs through these passages, which we kind of already touched on a little bit, is this idea of submitting, this idea of submission. It's applied to all of those three different categories that we talked about, and it's applied in this case to the fact that we have to place ourselves. This is literally what submission means. We place ourselves below somebody else out of a respect that is expressed through our obedience to that authority, to that relationship. The better example that I can think of is the submitting to one another in a marriage relationship. I consider the needs of my wife above of my own, ahead of my own. And that allows me to place myself under her. She does the same thing. And when we consider each other better than ourselves, when we submit to one another, that enables our relationship to thrive. And this is the same concept here. We're placing ourselves below our government. We are obeying our government because that is a means by which we give obedience and honor back to God. It's completely voluntary, and it's something that we should do automatically, I think. Obedience is to be given, he says here, to every human institution, every authority that God has instituted among men. That I think would include authority at all levels, from the highest all the way down to local and those things. Now he gives the example of kings or emperors and governors that they have instituted as their subordinates over things. But the key is not who we are to submit to. The key is why. He says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. Now, usually when Peter uses the phrase the Lord, he means Jesus, and that probably is very much the case right here. He is referring back to Jesus' command that his remember what Jesus told Peter way back in the Gospels. He said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And he was talking about paying taxes. And Peter was remembering that, I think, as he's writing this, as we serve Jesus, we honor him in the world. We give him the glory because we are obeying, we are responding in an appropriate way out of the holiness that he's creating inside of us. Now, Peter says there's a couple different reasons that governors and the authority is instituted over us. One is to punish evildoers, and two is to praise those who do right. So both of those are aspects of a leader over us. The implication here for us is that not only are we not to break the law, but we should be model citizens as we try to keep the law. Because as we look forward to what God is doing in our lives, creating holiness, that displays out of our obedience, not because it's the government that we live under, but because it's God that we live under. And so that is, even though he says we live as strangers and aliens, this world is not our home, while we're not permanent residents here, we are ambassadors of Jesus here. And so that means that we must contribute to our community, to the life around us, as much as we can in a positive and a beneficial way to the best of our ability. So it's not a call to abstain from being involved in the world around us. It's called to do so in such a way that brings glory and honor to Jesus. That's what Peter is saying here. And so he says that will result in, what do you say here? In silencing the ignorance of foolish men. Because when they see that we are obeying for the Lord's sake, they don't have anything to stand on in order to slander us, as he's referred to earlier. So we are called to live in the community in which we are in a way that, yes, we're strangers and we're aliens so far as the sinful way of life is concerned, but where there is a way for us to do good, where there is a way for us to live in such a way that people can be pointed to Jesus, we are called to do so. Now, verse 16 adds a little bit of a qualifier here that's very interesting. He says, act as free people. Now, if you want to talk about freedom more, go and read in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 or chapter 9, or go read in the book of Galatians, which talks about our freedom that we have in Christ. And we are free, yes, we are free to live in a way that honors Jesus. We are not under obligation under anybody else. We are God's slaves, and so our responsibility is to honor him. So Peter says, first of all, our freedom is freedom to do what is right. It's not freedom to do what we want to do. It's freedom to do what is right. It's freedom to use our abilities in a way that edifies others and gives glory to Jesus. And it doesn't allow us to disobey God, because we aren't completely free on our own. We are no longer slaves to the world. We are now slaves to righteousness, slaves to Jesus. And so our responsibility is to him. And so finally, the implication here of living as one of God's slaves, as submitting myself to his authority, Peter spells it out in a pretty straightforward way. He says, first of all, we are to honor everybody. This last verse, he says, honor all people. No matter what, no matter who. We are not to carry an air of superiority over others. We are not to look down on others. We are to honor all people. I may not agree with you. You may not agree with me. But we can honor one another in spite of that. To say that I disagree with you does not mean that I will not honor you, that I think less of you. It just means we have a difference of opinion on a specific matter that has nothing to do with honoring. I can still give you the honor and the love and the care that Jesus requires of us from one another. So we are to honor one another. Second of all, he says, love the brotherhood. We are to have love for the community of brothers, the Christian community around us, the church. We are to love the bride of Christ. This is the believing community of which we are a part of, but it's a whole lot bigger than just the local community of which I'm a part of. I am not just called to love Parkview Christian Church. I am also called to love all believers, whether they attend my church or go somewhere else. We are called to love because we're all the bride of Christ. We may have some differences in the way we approach things or the preferences we have on certain aspects of how we worship, but we are all part of the bride of Christ, and so we are to love the church. The third thing he says here in verse 17 is to honor all people, to love the brotherhood, fear God. This is a very restrictive comment. He wants us to fear God. Are we to fear anybody else? No, we're not to fear anyone else. We are to fear God. We fear him, and he delivers us from fear of other people because we know that he is the one that is keeping us safe, that he is the one that is protecting us, that he is the one that is guiding us and leading us, and that he is keeping us from those things in this world that might harm us. So we fear him. And then he says, honor the king. Fear the king? No, honor the king. The fear is reserved for God. Does that mean we treat the king, or in our case, the president or Congress or whoever it might be, do we treat them as the same as we do everyone else? Yeah, we honor all people. Several years ago, one of my kids was probably 4 or 5 at the time, and Our current president at that point was one that was probably a polar opposite of where I would find myself on the political spectrum. And yet this young child, at such an age, every day in his prayers, prayed that our president would come to know Jesus. He had the concept of this passage, honoring our leaders. And he prayed for our leaders every day. And that convicted me. And I had to make some changes in the structure of my prayer list so that I could incorporate praying for my leaders and honoring them in that means on a daily basis as we strive to live these lives of holiness that God has called us to. Now, he's talking about here, he's making a very, very positive comment here that we are to, our duties as Christians, as members in our society, in our community, mean honoring others, respecting others, loving others, and living in this world and not just completely ignoring it as these passing strangers and aliens, but we are to be involved in such a way. Does that mean that we have to be submissive in our political stance all the time? I don't know that it exactly does. Sometimes we have to submit even though we don't like it. But other times we may have to resist. We may have to resist in such a way that because the government is stepping into directions that do not honor God, and we have to resist. Now we have to do so in appropriate ways. You can't do so violently. You can't do so in a way that undermines the authority of God over our lives, that disrespects Him. We have to do so in a way that continues to honor Jesus and loves one another. But we have to stand for what God wants over us. There have been times in our nation's past where people have had to do that. I think of Martin Luther King Jr. standing against the authorities in order to spark the civil rights movement. There have been times in past through our history, around the globe, where people have had to stand against the instituted authorities because the instituted authority was doing something that was blatantly against God's design. I think, though, those are more the exception than the rule, and until we get to that point, we have to submit as much as we can, not because I like who may or may not be in the White House, but I submit to every human institution for the Lord's sake. I submit for Jesus' sake. My role is to live my life in such a way that Jesus gets the honor. I don't have to agree with it all the time. Guys, I'll tell you just straightforward. There's a lot of things, even in the pages of this, that I have a hard time with, that I don't like. I'm like, Jesus really calls me to do that? I don't want to do that. But we do, whether we like it or not. We do, because if that's what He's called us to, that's where we live. That's how we live. That's where we can put our focus and our efforts. And there are things that I would much rather ignore in these pages. And yet I have been called to submit to God and to submit to the authorities that He has placed in my life. Why? For Jesus' sake. So that the holiness that He is creating and building and strengthening in me can be seen to others around the world. Is this something that steps on our toes? Yeah, I think it is. We don't like the idea of submitting politically, especially if it's not our party or our platform or whatever you might want to call it. If that's the case, we probably need to be reminded that without respecting our rulers, we don't have a good view of government. So what Peter says here is not a license for us to do wrong. It's a license for us to make sure that our holiness shines forth regardless of where we might find ourselves. We have to, no matter what, let Jesus be seen clearly in our lives. In a world, in our current situation here in the United States of America, we are divided politically. We are divided across racial divides. We are divided over issues like gender. We are divided in so many ways. But we have a Savior who is not about dividing. He is about reuniting. He is about community. He is about restoration. He's about making us one with him and uniting us in unity with one another, especially in the church. And so as we live holy lives, we display that to the world that needs to see it. In our next session, we'll take a look at this idea of submission to our masters. And while we don't, most of us may not be in a situation we are a slave submitting to a master, we do have some principles that we can draw from that and move forward. And then we get to the big one in chapter 3 when he talks about husbands and wives and our roles toward one another there. And all of these ways, our submission is not for my government. My submission is not for my master or my employer. My submission is not for my wife, and hers is not for me. We submit for Jesus. And so as you seek to submit and as you seek to live holiness in your life, do so in a way that brings him the glory and allows the world to see him through your life, through my life, through the way that we live in the society in which we are a part of. Until next time, we'll see you soon.